What's up everyone, Patrick here to show you the new IFS and trailing arm kit for the Meus MB24 kit. So to start, just to kind of go over what you'll need, mostly it's going to be your 0.050 driver, just a standard SCX24 tool. All of the screws here will be included, plus a couple extras. And then bushings for the rear links and the full IFS assembly. This works with the Meus body, cage, and carbon chassis. And I would recommend a brass skid plate, but regardless, a stock style skid plate, and if you want, you can get a reversible one. This kit works with the Meus SCX24 rear axle. That's the same spacing as the IFS, so your front and rear wheels will be in line. You will need some front axle stubs. You'll have to shave them down like this. This doesn't have to be too precise. You can do, a little bit thicker up there. Just make sure that there's something to hang on to the inside of the bearing so that these don't slip out. This is what a stock one looks like. I just use a hacksaw, but you can use a Dremel and then just sand the burrs away. For suspension, I would recommend an AX24 style shock. These will have your hardware for M1.4, which will fit into the Meus chassis nicely. These next ones are definitely a nicer option. I've heard that the springs are stiff enough on these. On my personal micro runner over here, I'm running the RC all-wheel drive shocks as well as the Endura big bores. These are also AX24 length. That'll give you the travel that you want and the smoothness of an oil shock. Telescoping shocks do work, but it's going to be a very bouncy experience. And then lastly, these SWD sway bars here. I've got the carbon ones, and there's some more hardware, but I just will assemble these simply to give you guys the idea of where to do it along the build process. And then as for the pieces included in the kit, you will have your rear trailing arms and upper links. These are your rear sway bar mounts. This is a shock mount and electronics or battery tray. Sliders and trailing arm mounts. And then here is the center portion for the skid. Let's see, lower control arm, upper control arm. This is your spindle and hub. And then we've got this right here is the linkage for the steering rack. I don't know, it's swing set steering, I guess. And then these little things are your servo mounts and the connector for the front of the chassis to the skid plate. So now we'll just go through, assemble everything piece by piece, let you guys know what screws go where. This is how everything will be labeled. I just use a label maker for these. If you guys want to take those labels out and use the box for whatever afterwards, that's all good. Cool, let's get started. So we'll start with installing our bushings here. You'll get a packet of 30 bushings, so you'll have a couple left over. These links are just spares included with every kit, so don't install any bushings into these. It's an extra set of steering links and an extra set of sway bar links. For our control arms, the lower and the upper ones, we'll just use brass bushing with the rubber O-ring on the big side. And that way the small side can pass through, and these will all be from the outside to the inside. So there's our control arms done. The big side with the O-ring is facing outwards on all of these pieces. Next, we'll do our steering links and these sway bar links. These will use bushings with no rubber O-ring. So for the sway bar links, this is a bit of a tight fit. Sometimes it'll take a bit of pressure. There we go. But that kind of snaps into place. I'm trying to hold it kind of on either side so that I'm not bending the link excessively. And then for the small sway bar links, you'll want one bushing with the big side facing one way and the other one the opposite way. Now that we've got our sway links done, again, one side is the bigger face and same goes for the other side. So these are facing different directions. For the steering links, I'm doing both bushings will have the big face upwards, like so. The small face is on the smooth side. And then same goes for these bushings. They just kind of snap into place. You have to be kind of firm with it, but yeah, these links are nice and solid. So as long as you hold them evenly around the edge there, as you press it in, you won't have any issues. And then finally, for our trailing arms, rear uppers, and these final steering links, the trailing arms will have this wider side facing outwards, and the upper links, you'll see there's a printed surface and kind of a completely smooth surface. I put this printed surface outwards, but that doesn't matter. Just make sure that for both the trailing arms and the rear uppers, since they're being mounted to the outside of the axle, you'll want the big face of the bushing facing outward so that there's no risk of it slipping off. So I'll go ahead and do these links for the trailing arms. And then for these ones here, these small steering links, it doesn't matter too much. I typically put the wider face on this same side as the slope. And then for this link here, it's a little difficult to describe it, but the screw will go through here. So I'm gonna put the wide face on there, and then the screw is actually gonna come through the back on this part. So I'll put the wide face there. Once I'll install everything now and show you guys, and then once it's all installed, it'll make more sense. As I install this last bushing, a lot of these bushing tolerances are slightly on the tight side. So I'm trying to hold pressure around the eyelet as I push the bushing through. And this is just so that once you've gotten a few drives with it, all the tolerances aren't sloppy, everything's still nice and tight. Here's my original kit, and this play is mostly from the bearings there. You'll see that the steering knuckle doesn't move much at all. It's still a nice and solid setup. There isn't much play in it at all, and that's something that I really value. So yeah, sorry if there's a bit of frustration when installing these, but it'll just make for a better fit in the future. Again, for these trailing arms here, I'm keeping these bushings facing outwards so that they don't slip off. Yeah, nothing too particular. For like these links, it doesn't really matter because it's only moving side to side. It's not really twisting like this, so there's not much risk of it popping off. So to get started here, now that we've got our bushings all done, we can get that to the side. We'll need the Meus chassis and the body and the cage. This is a customer's build, so there's more cut out of this cage and the interior's gone. You will need to cut a little bit, like up here to fit the shock, and then a little bit out of the rear of the cage for shock clearance. But as far as I know, there should be another bar there in the interior, and I haven't really cut out anything too structural. We'll also need our skid plate and these two sliders / trailing arm mount. For these sliders, the nub here for the trailing arm will be facing towards the back, and we'll use two 8mm screws through those holes, not the rear hole, to attach the slider through the chassis and into the skid plate. All right, so now I've got my skid plate and my sliders attached. Again, it was two 8mm screws on either side through these center holes that attaches it to the skid. And you'll see these pieces kind of wrap around and fill in the gap between the skid plate and the chassis rail there. For the next part of the chassis, we'll be assembling, this is the servo mount and the connector from the chassis to the skid plate on the IFS. So this little piece right here is going to be our servo mount, and you'll see one side has a chamfer running along the outside, the other side is smooth, and then the inside of this piece here is also smooth. So these will go together, and you'll see that that contour there matches. And then using a 5.5mm screw, we'll run it through the outside inwards and just get these two locked in place. Now that we've got these assembled, this is how they'll be sitting in the chassis. This is a good time to line up that hole between the two pieces, which will make the next part of the installation much easier. And again, this chamfered side will be on the outside, and that'll just allow for the proper clearance for all the parts on the inside. These pieces here will notch into place on the frame. You'll see this lower screw that we've already installed is sticking out, and that will line up these two holes at the top and this bottom forward hole there. So we're going to use a 5.5mm screw there, and then two 3.6mm screws on the top two. You can use a longer screw, but it will be protruding on this side here. The 3.6mm screw will be flush. I'll install that on both sides and show you guys what it looks like. And this is what it should look like once you're done installing it. Again, we've got a 5.5mm screw bottom forward hole for the shock positioning. The top back hole has a 3.6mm screw, as well as this top one. We've got the carbon on the outside here, and these are mounted to the inside. As long as you lined up this hole originally, it should be easy. If you're threading this screw in and it's pushing this mount in a weird direction, just try and realign it and it'll go through smoothly. This is a good point to install the rear sway bar mount. You're gonna have this side facing backwards. And yeah, it really doesn't matter how you orient these. Just know that this whole pattern there aligns with these two holes. So you'll see there's 3 holes in the back, small ones, and then those two, and that's where this sway bar mount will thread in. I'm gonna use 2 3.6mm screws back here. Again, you can use longer ones. This is just to keep it flush on the inside, and because the sway bar really won't experience any side-to-side pulling, this will be a nice secure mount regardless. Now that your sway bar mounts are installed, one on each side on the inside of the rails, facing backwards, they'll clear just fine. You can face them forward as well. It doesn't matter too much. We'll go ahead and install our rear uppers. So you'll see there is a pass-through hole there. If your bit doesn't fit for whatever reason, just take a drill bit and very gently make this hole bigger, but most bits will fit just fine. And for the rear uppers, you're gonna angle them or face them with this angle towards the back and upwards. That will fit in the normal position on the skid plate. And you're gonna wanna use a 12mm screw for the rear upper and a 10mm screw for the trailing arm when we get to that. So now I've got my rear uppers mounted, again, in the stock position with a 12mm screw, and my trailing arms, that'll go through that lower position on the sliders, and that just uses a 10mm screw. So one on each side, and then you're gonna want the wider part of the trailing arms facing outward, and the bend in the upper link facing upward. Now we'll start on the IFS. For these knuckles, let's see. You're gonna want, there's one side that's got more of a cutout to it. You're gonna want that side to be facing forward along with this part of the knuckle that holds the steering link. And using two 5mm screws, one up top and one on the bottom, we'll get both of these assembled. I've got these assembled, and I'm just looking to get the top of the screw head flush with the top of the hub here. Same goes for the bottom. Next, I'll assemble these two pieces for the skid. They slide in together like that, and then using a 5.5mm screw, you can just set that in place so that it doesn't move around at all. Next, we'll do the swing set steering assembly. So I'll be using a few 12mm screws. First, they'll pass through this piece, and it doesn't matter if it's upside down, but you'll want to keep an eye on this. I prefer to keep this on the passenger side, and that way I orient my servo with the servo horn on the driver's side, but you can also do it vice versa. That screw will thread in from the top through the steering link with these ridges up top, and then into this piece here with that slope on the bottom. So I'll screw that together, and I'll do the other side the same way. And the final piece for the steering assembly is this angled link. I ran an 8mm screw through the front, and then now is also a good time to attach your servo horn if you want. It'll be here with the opening for the servo towards the back. And you can also use an 8mm screw for that through this bushing and into the servo horn. One note, these screws here, I try not to tighten them too much. I want this to be able to move freely. A little bit of resistance is fine, but just don't over tighten these, as that'll put some unnecessary strain on the servo. From here, I'll use two 12mm screws in these open bushings. Again, these pieces are on the bottom with that slope facing downwards, then the steering link. And I'll use two 12mm screws and thread them in to there and in there. Once this is all assembled, make sure that it's moving nice and smoothly. We can put that aside. We'll take this little piece that kind of looks like a boot and our two upper control arms. This is going to have the smooth face upwards, and this closed section will be pointing in the same direction as this little boot. I'll use two 8mm screws for each side through both bushings, and that will complete this part here. With our upper control arms assembled, we can now install the lower control arms. I like to face this hole backwards. That's where the screw will go to hold the shock. But yeah, just for aesthetics, I like to keep this smooth side facing forward. We will use, we'll use two 12mm screws passing through the front skid plate there, and you'll feel them thread in there. And then two 10mm screws for the back of the control arm here. With the lower control arms on, two 12mm screws in the front, two 10mm screws in the back, we can go ahead and attach these sway links. So they'll go on these little nubs here, and I want the wide part of the bushing facing outwards when I put these on, and that'll make the top bushing have the wide side on the inside. I think I forgot to mention it, but you'll want to use 8mm screws to attach these sway bar links. After that, you can take your sway bar. Yours will have some more pieces in there. Ask SWD about the best arrangement for washers and nuts and stuff like that. But this will pass through this piece here. And then I like to give it just a little bit of space on each side. That allows it to move a little more smoothly, doesn't really get hung up. And yeah, just you know, a millimeter or two on either side. Doesn't have to be too specific. But this is a great time to line it up, tighten it down, make sure that everything is nice and straight. And once that is attached like that, you can use two 5.5mm screws through the bottom there and into this piece. Now that the two screws are through there, this will be a nice and solid connection, and you can go ahead and attach your sway bar to these sway bar links. I'm going to put the bushing on the inside like that, and I like to run a screw from the outside to a nut on the inside. It's these little nuts. They're a little tricky to use. I have some needle nose pliers for jewelry that I hold onto these with. And you'll just do that on both sides. The reason it's easier to put the nut on the inside is if that link does break, it's easier to get the screwdriver from the outside and hold it on the inside with those pliers and switch out that link if need be. Now I've got this all assembled. Again, you're going to want to make sure to tighten your sway bar down at this point. Make sure it's not moving anywhere so that these move together up and down. I'd recommend Loctite both on the sway bar and on these nuts on the inside here. This was an 8mm screw. I don't know if I mentioned that, but make sure these are nice and tight. If they rattle loose, it's just a hassle to put them back together. We're getting close to the finish line here. I'm going to attach my upper control arms. I want this boot here facing forward, and that'll line up with the 3 holes left in the skid plate. And you'll use 3 8mm screws through the bottom there. They'll be recessed a little ways, and just make sure that that connection is nice and solid. With these upper control arms attached, it's time to put our spindles and knuckles on. For these spindles here, I'll line up the holes there at the bottom. I want a 5mm screw on each side, and then one 10mm screw through the upper control arm. And technically you can do it from either side, but I'd recommend using the rear facing hole here. With the spindles attached to the upper and lower control arms, the two 5mm screws, or 4 I guess, down here, and the 10mm screws up top. Just make sure that everything feels nice and smooth, that the sway bar is moving as it should. Now is the best time to diagnose anything that could be incorrect. Again, a little bit of friction is fine, just like with those bushings. After a few drives, it'll be feeling exactly the way you want it to. And yeah, I'm just feeling a little bit of friction right now, but give it a few drives and everything will loosen up as it should. Now with the upper and lower control arms attached, that 10mm screw through the top and the two 5.5mm screws down low on both sides. The final step for the steering assembly is to use an 8mm screw through the top of the steering link into the hub here. And this is also a good point to install your bearing on the inside of the hub, as well as your axle stub. Once you attach the steering link, you can always, disassemble it and take this all apart, but once you attach the steering link, there's no way for this to fall out. So at this point, you should have your inner bearings and these axle stubs, as well as the steering links attached. Make sure that everything's moving freely. It should be full range of travel and steering in all positions. I realized I made an error earlier. I installed a previous version of these sliders. The orientation's the same, it's just that this one, the newer one, has a minor cutout here for these screws. From here, you can attach the IFS to the lower portion of the skid plate here with a 10mm screw, one on each side, and then to these front brackets that we attached to the chassis earlier with two 5.5mm screws, one on each side. So with our IFS attached, we can put in this final piece here. Let's see. So that will line up, this front hole on the piece will line up right with that hole there on the chassis. And then this hole here is optional, depending on if your shocks are gonna hit it or not. And then you can use this hole in the back here as well. So we'll use the 3.6mm screws for this as well. And yeah, if your shock doesn't hit this one here, you can use 3 on each side. Otherwise, just the 2 here is enough. And that's the shock mount / battery tray / electronics mount in there. Again, I left that middle screw out. You don't need it, but if you want to, you can definitely put it in there. I added the bearings on the outsides there, and I also mounted the rear axle just to show you guys. I like to start with this middle forward hole for the upper, and then for the trailing arms, I mount them through, so the screw goes through the bushing, through the outer eyelet right there, and then with a nut on the inside. And that hardware is included in the kit. So yeah, there shouldn't be too much that you guys need to source other than the electronics. ESC, I'd recommend a forward-facing motor of some kind. And yeah, these links are about 68mm, I think. So a C10 or deadbolt drive shaft, but I'll specify all that in the item description. Please reach out to me if you guys have any questions. Not much really else to say. Very excited to have this product. I'm going to be posting some running videos, especially on my Instagram, maybe here on YouTube. But this was basically just a detailed assembly video for you guys. Please reach out to me if you guys have any questions. And thank you so much for watching. Hey guys, so I know I just ended the video, but a couple final notes because I know I'll get questions. For the front, this little nub up top, that's going to be your ideal shock mount for the AX24 shocks. If you want to use one of these lower ones, that's fine. And then like an 8 or a 10 millimeter screw up here, preferably. 8 millimeter screw for down here. It's a little bit tricky to line it up, but if you just kind of try and look through, you'll see it. And then for the rear, the further back you mount the shock here, the more leverage you'll have, but less travel. I like to run them at a bit of an angle, but not too steep. And then let SWD know that you're getting the MB24 kit, and he'll get you the right parts for the sway bars. The sway bar, I mounted it to the shock mount here on the axle, not in the trailing arm. This just allows for free range of motion. And then you will need to cut a bit out of the cage back here just to clear the shocks and the sway bar. Depending on what motor setup you get, you can cut this. Dremel, if you're using like flush cut pliers, just be careful, especially cutting along the layer lines. It can split. So yeah, Dremel is best. And then if you're running a forward facing motor, depending on how big it is, you might be able to put this cross member in that it comes with a Velcro mount. But if not, you can just put some Velcro on top of the servo or magnets, and then on the hood here. It's got just the right amount of clearance for that. And yeah, last note, the carbon sway bars from SWD are a little more expensive, but they look really good with this chassis. So yeah, cool. Thanks guys for staying until the end. Peace.